So I imported the 3D model into Blender and I used it to make cross sections which are transferred onto this big foam sheet, as you can see. I've marked out a grid so that I could transfer the outlines accurately. And to cut them out I used a knife, which I heated up with a blowtorch, and this just cut through it really easily, as you'll see. So I cut out about 6 cross-sectional slices and taped these together. I gradually built up the head from the base, as you can see, using aluminium foil. Originally I wanted to use papier mâché, but it was just far too cold. It was the middle of winter and there was no chance of it drying. The workshop that I was working in was obviously cold, but it was also quite humid, which meant that there was just no way that the wallpaper paste could dry. This should have been a lot quicker really if the base cross sections would have been finer, but because they were quite thick it meant that the shape was kind of lost and I ended up making most of it myself. If I was doing this again I'd definitely use more layers for the base. I used about 6 here, but I think at least 15 would be ideal. I decided that the jaw was just far too big. I ended up cutting most of it away with a Stanley knife. I was reluctant to do this, but looking back I'm really glad I did. So this is the making of the horns. I definitely think that the wire that I used was just far too thin. You can see how I've tried to build it up a little bit with this aluminium foil, but it's just far too thin. And then I bulked it up with expanding foam. This worked quite well, but there was a lot of clean-up involved. It really made a mess, but it did get the job done. I think ideally I would make some kind of structure to enclose the foam as it dries, but unfortunately I didn't think of that. You'll notice there's a lot of dripping and a lot of excess, which just covered the floor in this horrible stuff, and also meant that I had to cut off a lot later. But in any case, it was really quick and really cheap, so I can't complain. So once it was dry, I trimmed it off with a knife. You can see I've put some rings of duct tape around it. That was mainly just for me so that I could see the form. And then I added a layer of fiberglass just for strength. You can see I've paid particular attention to the bottom. This was just the weakest part really. I wasn't worried about the base because it's nice and thick. But if I had the budget I would have liked to fiberglass the entire thing. And here I'm just covering the whole thing in duct tape. For some reason my clay just happened to stick really well to it. So here I'm painting the eyes. I'm really happy with the way these turned out. I'm just blocking in the basic gradient here. And I'm using a little rotary tool to carve out the pupils, and this really just adds a lot of depth. It gives the illusion that it's actually an opening like a real eye once the resin's been cast over it. So here are the teeth. To make these I mixed together Super Sculpey and Fimo, which are both quite weak on their own, but it turned out to be extremely strong. And they also polish really nicely. It's not too glossy, which is perfect for a tooth effect. And here I begin the sculpting. So even though this was the first part, the nose, if you can't already tell, this is actually one of my favourite parts. I think the wrinkles look really realistic, as you'll see in a minute. So the clay I'm using is Das air drying clay. To be honest, it's not very nice to work with. You can't get very much detail because it's really fibery, but the advantage is that it's very cheap and very strong as well. You can get other clays at a similar price which will allow you to sculpt with much finer detail because they don't have the vegetable fibres in it, but the strength was really important on this project, so I think I ended up using about 30 packs, which is a hell of a lot obviously. It's a lot more than I thought it would take. And a pack of 5 was about £15, so there's a good £180 worth of clay there. That's pounds sterling, of course. So now moving on to the mouth. This is the lower jaw, the teeth. I made the tongue separately and stuck that in. It's just a solid piece of clay that I've shaped. And I put the teeth in here, but they're not permanently fixed there, just so I can shape the gums. I think this project probably took me in total about 4 months, which I learnt a lot in that time, as you can imagine. I don't really have a great deal of sculpting experience to begin with, so I definitely feel like if I was to go back to the beginning and start from scratch, it would just be even better. There's lots of things I would do differently. This was definitely one of the most challenging parts of the sculpture. It's a really complex mouth compared to if you had to sculpt a human's mouth. There's a lot to consider about how the teeth will interlock with each other as the jaw opens and closes, which is why it took a long time to sort of line everything up really nicely. I really like the design, how they've kept the teeth looking really sort of organic and natural, and they haven't gone too over the top. I think that apart from this third eye, it actually looks a lot like something that could exist in our world, and I think it makes it a lot more striking. I really think it improves the look of it. So I definitely think the developers have done a great job designing this. So unfortunately I didn't get any footage of this, but the eyes have been cast over with a resin dome, and this really just gives it it makes them just far more realistic, and I also polished them in the same way that I did the teeth, but they did have to be repolished at the end with some T-cut, which really went well, and I think that I got the eyes a lot shinier than I thought was possible at first. So using DAS clay meant that I couldn't do everything at once. Sections would dry and then I'd have to sort of blend them in with the next section, and this wasn't ideal, but it was a sacrifice I needed to make really, otherwise I would have been spending a lot more money on proper clay. Here I do both the left and right side of the face in one session, and this was really the limit of the DAS clay. I think if I'd have tried to do any more, I wouldn't have been able to get the detail I wanted because it just dries so quickly. You'll notice that while I was doing the face I was actually inside, so it was a lot warmer, which is why it dried so quickly, but back in the garage it tended to dry a lot slower, which was actually probably an advantage because it meant that there was less cracking. So the horns were the least fun part of the project. They just took a really long time. It took a lot of motivation to get through all of that, but I really like the way they've come out and I really like the texture. I did have some issues with cracking on the horns, but it just meant that I had to approach it a little bit differently. I had to do it in rings rather than try and do long strips as I had been doing. It used a massive amount of clay too. I think just the part that's visible in this clip was about 3 kilograms worth of clay. So the weight of the horns was what was making them crack. The way that I fixed it was just to build up the base around the back and just with a really thick layer of clay just to make it extra strong.